Good afternoon, everybody. Jambo, welcome. My name is Kobe Sandy, and I am your host for this evening's proceedings. And today we have with us a very exciting and exhilarating panel to discuss African identity, among other things. You just now saw there was a dance from our African society entitled Lamban, meaning West African. And certainly the students at the UB have talent. And that was one of our events we had back when we had physical gatherings, normal again, but soon it will be there. But nevertheless, we enjoy it as we are here now. Bringing greetings on behalf of the Guild Council is none other than the National Affairs Chairperson, who is a partner of today's proceedings. And I welcome today Mr. Darian Thomas, our NACC, to bring greetings.
Hi all, and welcome to Emancipation Matters Part 2. I am Darian Thomas, your National Affairs Committee Chairperson, and I bring greetings from the National Affairs Committee on behalf of the Guild of Students. As a nation of Trinidad and Tobago, emancipation is of great importance to us, and an event like this, the Touch on Emancipation, is of high importance in terms of educating and bringing about a cultural awareness of what being emancipation truly means as a people and as a nation. And as a result, we introduce to you Emancipation Matters Part 2. Now we have a lot of amazing and exciting keynote speakers, panelist members, dancers, singers, and spoken word. So sit back, relax, have a drink or two, but nothing too hard, please, and enjoy our event, Emancipation Matters. I thank you. Back to you, Mr. Kobe Sandy.
Thank you very much, that's Mr. Darian Thomas. Indeed, have a drink or two because today is going to be great. This is our part 2. Last year we had part 1, and we certainly had some insightful gems you would have received from various persons last year. And again, this year, we are continuing the drive to showcase African culture and heritage as we celebrate Emancipation Day come tomorrow, praise the Lord. Now, of course, you are here looking on. I will call you on to continue to share the live and share with your colleagues, share with your family members, put on the TV, we on YouTube, we on Facebook here, for everybody to come and look because we have some great things in store. We have talent, we have dance, we have song, we have good speakers, persons who from the academic cloth is coming here, as well as the political cloth, coming to talk to us about African identity. And of course, I am going to introduce our first keynote speaker. He is no stranger to the UE space, having been a lecturer here. But most recently, the very distinguished Dr. Lovell Francis was elected in the 11th Parliament as the Member of Parliament for Muruga Tableland. And he was also appointed Minister in the Ministry of Education in the last incarnation. And I'm bringing here to us a very dynamic man who has impacted the lives of hundreds within the UV space and also many more in the national space. And I bring to you Dr. Lovell Francis, who will be speaking on colonization, slavery, and the fight for emancipation. So let's welcome and put a clap in the chat for Dr. Lovell Francis.
Good evening, everyone. It is truly an honor and a pleasure to be here this evening. My mother had a thing she used to say, she borrowed from Shakespeare, that brevity is the soul of wit. When she said that back in the day, she meant to shut up. But I'll use that as an excuse this afternoon to get right to the issue because I only have 15 minutes, so I'm getting on it. Now, I'm talking about colonialism, enslavement, and emancipation. And I want to start by making a clear distinction between enslavement or slavery in inverted commas as it existed in the ancient world or traditionally, and then this unique phenomenon that became African enslavement. Now, all of us have things in this world that we don't like to do. For example, there's a few meters from me right now, there's a very large black vehicle that is really a lighter shade of brown because it has not been washed in a long time. I don't like to wash vehicles. Now, that presents me with two choices. I could either bite the bullet, get a bucket, get a hose, and do some washing, which I will not do, I will mention, or I could pay someone else to do it. And those are the only two options I have. But it used to be a thing in the ancient world that there was a third option. And given circumstances, it ended up being the first option. And that option was to kidnap somebody against their will, take them from their homeland, bring them to wherever you are, and to make them do it. And this is what we call slavery or enslavement. It was really an economic thing. It was about getting work done that you essentially didn't want to do yourself. And the thing you need to understand is that it was entirely normal. It was considered normal. In fact, my research into enslavement has transcended Caribbean society, the Americas. In fact, I went back to the ancient times to look at what it meant back then. And of all of the major ancient civilizations, I've only identified two that were either queasy about enslavement or were very much against it. The Persian Empire, they banned enslavement, slavery outright. They were very much against it. There was no enslavement in the empire. The only other ancient civilization that I could find that was queasy about enslavement was, interestingly, the Egyptians. Now, it was once a thing that it was believed that those massive pyramids were built by people who were enslaved. But newer research has highlighted that they were actually workers who were honored, respected, and remarkably well paid. So there was not as much enslavement in Egyptian society as we thought previously. Every other major ancient society, enslavement was normal. It didn't matter what you looked like. No one in particular was assigned the role of a slave or an enslaved person. You could be of any ethnicity. They did not care what you looked like. They didn't care where you came from. For example, if you were Roman, unless you were Greek in particular, and they even enslaved some Greeks, anybody else could be enslaved. The Romans didn't care your ethnicity, they didn't care your skin color. Once you were not Roman, you could be enslaved. And that was normal. It was an economic system to get work done without paying the workers. African enslavement, tremendously different. Yes, also an economic system. Yes, also a way of getting work done without paying. But it was the first time in the history of the world that a group of people was singled out because of their ethnicity, because of where they came from, to be enslaved. It was the first time that an entire system of dehumanization, including this thing that we know in the modern world as racism, was created to justify this enslavement. In fact, it went so far that it went into the realm of the religious. I am sure many of you went to Sunday school in your time and you'd have heard of the story of Cain and Abel. What you might not have known is that after Cain was supposed to have murdered Abel, God, the Bible says that God put a mark on him. Without a DNA test in sight, without any evidence of any kind, it was explained that that mark was the dark hue of our skins. And this was a mark that meant that the descendants of Cain could be enslaved. There were other stories. There's a story of a son of Noah named Ham. I don't have time for the entire story, but Noah ends up cursing his son that his descendants will be forever, and I'll use the biblical term, the hewers of wood and the drawers of water. If you read the Bible and you ever see the phrase hewers of wood and drawers of water, it meant that you were enslaved. So there were a number of differences, there were a number of things that made African enslavement a unique phenomenon that separated it from a long history and a long tradition of enslavement. It was the first time millions of people, as though an industrial kind of thing, would be kidnapped from their home country and taken somewhere else to do manual labor. Europeans were not the first people to come to Africa to capture Africans and enslave them, but they made it into a globalized industry. That kind of thing had never happened before. What happened before was that you enslaved those ethnic groups, or those, to use a bad word, tribes that you were enemies with. You went to war with them, you won, you killed the men, you enslaved those who were not fighters, you enslaved the women, you enslaved the children. It was a localized thing. African enslavement becomes a transnational thing, a global thing, a globalized industry. So what you have is a system of enslavement that is tremendously different from anything that existed before it, and I hope anything that will exist ever on this planet again. A unique phenomenon. Now, I want to change tack a bit and talk about the people who end up being enslaved. And I want you all to understand something from the beginning. Those people never accepted being enslaved. They never accepted that there was a right to capture them. They never accepted that there was a right to transplant them across the Atlantic. They fought capture. They fought in the barracoons. They fought on the ships. They resisted as much as they could. Many of them chose death. They jumped overboard. Many of them tried to starve themselves to death. Many of them tried to kill themselves however they could on those slave ships. The Portuguese had a word that they would use to describe their slave ships. The nickname for it was tombeiros. A tombero in Portuguese is a floating coffin. So it gives you the kind of idea of what was happening on these journeys. When they got to the Caribbean and they went through that hideous process of being bartered like possessions, as though they were less valuable than a dog or a horse. And they got to those plantations, and you're talking in the context of Trinidad, you're talking in the context of Tobago, Barbados, Jamaica, you're talking people who end up being enslaved primarily on sugar plantations. You need to understand that these people resisted enslavement in many ways. They acted foolish. They dotish. They can't do anything. Anything you ask them to do, it's too difficult. From whence comes the myth that people of African origin, or at least in our context, one of the reasons why that myth of inferior intelligence begins, because people were actually acting foolish on the plantation. But why would you act intelligent on a plantation where you have been enslaved and your labor is being forced from you? They sabotaged everything. They burned the canes out of time. They burned buildings. They poisoned the master if they could. They worked slowly. They did any manner of things to disrupt the system, to disrupt the profits of the plantation owner, to make life on the plantation as difficult as possible. But they also did other things that we hardly ever give them credit for. Now, I remember lecturing a long time ago in UB, it feels like a long time, just a few years, but it feels like a long time, and telling my students back then that they were enslaved persons who had money. And they were like, what? Who? How? Where? Because if you understand the central tenets of enslavement, they were very simple. You were overworked, you were punished for the most insignificant infractions, and perhaps the most significant of them was that you were not paid. But there were enslaved people who found innovative ways of earning property, of earning cash, earning money, even though the entire framework and the entire culture of enslavement mandated that they should not have. For example, I'm sure many of you will be getting up very early in the morning to go to the market to buy your fresh food tomorrow. If not, I hope you will change that. Healthy living is important, particularly COVID has unmasked that in our culture right now. Many of you might not be aware that the tradition of Market Sunday in the Caribbean is born out of the experience of enslavement. It is born out of the labor of the enslaved on the plantation. It is born out of the fact that enslaved people were never given the food rations that all of these ridiculous slave codes said that they should be given. What they would do instead of giving you a ration of saltfish or salted meat or smoked herring for the week, the master would give you a plot called provision grounds. And after laboring in the fields or the factories all day, you were expected to go on those grounds whenever you found time and to plant and produce food to feed yourself. Those enslaved people were so productive that they were able to sell the excess food on Sundays, which was the only day where labor was not conventionally allowed. On Sunday, the interesting thing is that often the master or the master's wife would go to the market and would end up buying produce produced by the enslaved persons, and particularly women, on Sunday. And that is where the tradition of Market Sunday begins, from enslaved women selling their excess food, the excess food they produced to feed themselves, selling whatever was excess in the market on Sunday and earning money. Enslaved men, many of them acquired skills by working in the factories, and many of them were employed as what we would call tradesmen today. Back then it was called quote unquote jobbing slaves. And they were hired out for their skills and they earned money. So one of the more interesting things that we have discovered by looking at the evidence is that many of those enslaved people who by law were only considered property actually left the plantation with property, in the sense of they owned things which they were not supposed to do, and they had cash which they were not supposed to have. In fact, I saw one case of a master who was broke borrowing money from his enslaved people, which really, really blew my mind. All of this points to a central fact that for very long, Caribbean history has not or did not acknowledge in a very, very sensible way. The enslaved were not some mythical creatures who were human one day and then abracadabra became this monster called a slave. The enslaved people in the Caribbean, the enslaved people in Trinidad, the enslaved people in Tobago were human beings. They were human beings. They were creative, they were imaginative, they were capable of thought, and they found ways to game the system. And game it they did. So we could talk about emancipation as this grandiose legal thing that happens in England, where you have these people called the abolitionists who fight to abolish the trade in captured Africans, and then fight to bring legalized emancipation to the Caribbean, which happens in 1834, 1838. Or we could talk about a more sensible process of people who are on one hand, not accepting of being enslaved, and on the other hand, on the plantation, doing everything possible to undermine the system. If I could borrow one of your hands, people in other islands who are revolting and making the whole system of enslavement seem untenable. I'm sure all of you have heard of the Haitian Revolution, and that event sent shock waves through the entire Americas, because it made enslavement look like a dangerous thing, not just for the plantation owners, for the entire European infrastructure that controlled these colonies. African people, enslaved people, played a pivotal part in the coming of emancipation. And when that event came, they were also instrumental in helping to transform what were quote-unquote slave societies into what became free societies. And I'm already past 15 minutes, but I just want to say one thing about colonialism. Because all of this system, all of that enslavement, slavery, all of it happens within a bubble called colonialism. And for very long, we were taught this system was like a benign cancer, something that was there to civilize us, something that was there to bring European type structures and processes and organization to our culture. And it is one of the biggest lies that has been taught us. When I taught at UE, I used to make a very simple analogy. Take a finger, all of you know the verb to choke. Now, if you choke someone in the eye by mistake, you will say sorry. Well, if you're wise. Colonialism is the proverbial choke in the eye to which there is no apology. Colonialism was naked exploitation. It was a system constructed by which the Europeans who came here, not as explorers, not as adventurers, not as discoverers, they came here with a specific intent, which was to acquire wealth. In the case of Spanish America, in the form of gold and silver. In the case of the British and the French, in terms of agricultural output. And our societies were only supposed to exist for one reason, which was to make those nations of Western Europe richer. There was no thought to sustainable societies here. It never occurred to them. So there's one thing, we are an overly critical society. Trinidadians and Tobagonians are very good at telling you everything wrong, particularly everything wrong here, everything wrong with us. And in the midst of that, oftentimes we don't acknowledge when we've done very well. So I will say this to all of you. Two things. Never accept from anybody the sense that because you are of African origin, you are somehow a victim of history. It is not true. Our ancestors were not victims. They were captured against their will. They were brought and subjugated, but they never gave up the fight. They found ways to make their lives better. They found ways to make their lives livable. And most importantly, they found ways to survive. And they made far more of their emancipation than we understand. Within a generation of emancipation in Trinidad and Tobago, it is fantastic to understand that people who were largely illiterate, for example, because of all of the enslaved codes that existed, all of which said that it was illegal to the point of death to educate an enslaved person. The children and the grandchildren of our enslaved ancestors were literate in just 1 or 2 generations. And that is a kind of cultural change that does not happen without tremendous effort and tremendous regard for this thing called education. Don't accept that you are, because of your African heritage, a victim of history, and do not ever misunderstand the marvelous thing that is Caribbean society. We were created to be throwaway societies, only created to provide wealth for someone elsewhere. And we have managed to build thriving societies that have been sustainable. Yes, they have their struggles, but that is par for the course. But we have survived and thrived when there was no thought, no concern, or no caring for that reality. And I'm done. Peace and love, people.
and that was hold a little while longer, again from our African society. And indeed, we just now had Dr. Lovell Francis speaking to us on colonialization, slavery, and the fight for emancipation. But certainly he wouldn't be leaving us now, because we will be having the question and answer segment coming very soon, and he will be surely to answer your questions. I want to big up the people in the chat. I want to big up Jabari Glasgow, Ali Bob. I want to big up Jeremiah Mathura, Kevin Sawyer, Kira Alexander, Ria Duncan, to come in the live and of course share, and to have your colleagues and your friends and family listen to the great education we're having here. This is the UWI Guild of Students, our African Students Union, our African Society coming together to present to you Emancipation Matters Part 2. And we are heading into another distinguished colleague of mine. He is, well, he actually started in my position as Guild President 10 years ago. But now, and always has been, he is considered a social justice activist, a youth advocate, a student-centered advocate. He is a feminist by all definitions. He is one that is centered on true social reform in this country and the Caribbean. He is indeed a Caribbean man. And yesterday he would have received another year in life. And I want to wish him a happy belated birthday. And I want to bring on to us the very distinguished and affable Milka Sanatan to talk to us on Makandal Daga and the challenge to systemic racism during the 1970s. Mr. Sanatan, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Guild President Kobe Sandy. It's a pleasure to take in that. I wanted to know who were you introducing after you read out that bio, but I could take my role as a bacchanalist and a lima, and in that I also enjoy this having a sense of history, a historical consciousness, a geographic consciousness, and a political imagination that makes us ask certain questions about where we want to be in the present. And it's a pleasure, of course, to follow after Dr. Francis, a historian, a lecturer in Caribbean civilization, and a former Minister of Education who really understands the role of debunking myths about peoples, which persist today and has serious implications for the way that we have this unequal social order that we live in. But at the same time, reminding us that it was hard work that brought about key changes in our society. And that actually sets the background upon which I'll discuss Makandal Daga. I really want to lift his memory as a revolutionary student leader. Makandal Daga was instrumental in ensuring that the Guild President sits in the Finance and General Purposes Committee, has representation across all statutory committees at the university level. He was very critical of Guild councillors who flew frequently and didn't seem to attend campus business. But he was also criticized for not being a very present councillor because he was busy doing the work of the people. And there were some key administrative issues his councillors felt strongly about where he wasn't there. But it makes us ask this question: what does a Guild president look like in a revolutionary moment? And that is where I'll go with my conversation. He was born Geddes Granger in 1935 in Laventille, Trinidad and Tobago. And Granger, whose race consciousness and sense of historical duty, it really inspired a generation of revolutionaries. He changed his name to Makandal Daga at the height of his popular political power and leadership. But on August the 8th of 2016, Makandal Daga died. And there were some letters to the editor and column pieces by the usual commentators on the significance of his life. But the overwhelming silence on his death was striking, but it wasn't surprising at all. The majority of youth today do not know who Makandal Daga was. The Black Power Revolution was and is not systemically taught in schools. As with any social change movements, the country has divided opinions on the matter, still behind. But 5 decades of independence is also short in the life of a society. And last, I think his entry into the government As part of the coalition with Kamla Persad led People's Partnership in 2010, it introduced him to a new political constituency of Indo-Trinidadians, but in a large way disenfranchised him from a wide section of the Afro-Trinidad and Tobago population, who in some quarters saw him as a race traitor, bluntly described in the Calypsonian Crocro's Compare and Contrast in 2011. He said, he's a prostitute of Black power, a leg-bottom African. And these tensions around McCandle Dagger, especially in his later years, show us the importance of the March to Carney, the objectives, how they were relevant then as they are today. The Black Power revolutionaries challenged the ruling government to fulfill their political promises of independence in the currency of a transformed social and economic landscape. Rather early, almost 1 decade after independence, the post-colonial state structure was called into question. Today's struggles in South Africa of youth challenging the corruption, hegemony, and economic mismanagement of the African National Congress evoke similar narratives. Black Power gripped the nation in the 1970s with the youthful leadership of Daga and his growing political community. For the public, it was already understood by many in their minds that Dr. Eric Williams, too, represented a kind of Black Power in the 1950s. For many, Williams' delivery of independence brought a widespread feeling that he carried Trinidad and Tobago to the promised land of independence. While Daga and the Black Power revolutionaries challenged the political dominance of the People's National Movement and the personality of Dr. Williams, in retrospect, one may argue that they may have underscored the degree to which Dr. Eric Williams' dominance was due to his wealth regarding political legitimacy. With the state of emergency enforced by the state, the mass uprising was suppressed. The NJAC leadership was jailed and young revolutionaries came face to face with state violence. In the years to come, NJAC would also fail miserably as a political organization. The example illustrates that rallies and marches that attracted tens of thousands of people and goodwill were not enough to run against the political party machinery of the day. They have failed to win a seat each time for every elections that they went up. Brian Meeks described the Black Power Revolution of 1970 as an aborted revolution. For Meeks, drawing on classical Marxist definitions of revolution, he evaluates the Black Power Revolution against the movement's ability to wrench state power from the hands of the ruling class. The NJAC failed to do so from the PNM. At the same time, he argues that a revolution can occur even if it has never achieved dismantling the dominant political regime. For all that, I think the Black Power Revolution was an incomplete revolution. During the 1970s, there were multiple political trends on the left and progressive fronts. NJAC, while consistently challenged for their conceptions of race and class, had more success in communicating their theoretical positions on anti-imperialism in Trinidad and Tobago. The growing public pressure against foreign-owned companies that determine the major sectors in the economy forced the government's hand to expand the public shareholding of industries. What followed was a very wide nationalization of the extractive industries and financial sector. Government cooperatives were set up in response to the calls for greater participation and dignity for the Black man. By the 1970s, the state in Trinidad and Tobago had the largest holding of property after countries like Cuba. And then the oil boom came and it expanded the political patronage of the state. And guess what happened? In many ways, it quelled the popular discontent. And Williams was on top again. Black Power was no more. By that time, the shake-up to the social order as an outcome of the social revolution of Black Power moved a significant number of ordinary Afro and Indo citizens into the upper echelons of society, particularly the middle class. In more ways than one, there is merit in the statement, NJAC was a midwife to the new society, as Sarah and Ryan called it. The revolutionary sentiments and proposals of the growing discontent of the urban working class, the unemployed, and students who formed the base of the struggle in 1970, they were really co-opted by the state, the ruling PNM, and it ushered in a very important period of reformism as well. That broke Daga, and in many ways it broke NJAC. And their desire to break away from the logic of the ruling party, as well as the patronage, was never achieved. But what the revolution did achieve was breaking the perception that the PNM was untouchable, unaccountable to ordinary people. And this is also part of the intra-party democracy of the PNM, because they were new political leaders who embraced some of the key arguments and philosophies of the Black Power Revolution. On seeing the headline of the news of McConnell Dagger's death, I remember I closed my laptop immediately. I sat quietly. I began to reflect on his life. I begged myself to think that his revolution was not in vain. The social attitudes of the society and the bureaucracy have significantly changed since 1970. But I will not say that people's power and participation is the same as it was in the past. And in 2011, I had the opportunity to meet the chief servant, McConnell Dagger, at Duke Street, Port of Spain. In the crumbling NJAC building upstairs, I waited for him as anyone would wait on a high government official. I was summoned by one of his staff members. McConnell Dagger was a frail old man. He had a sharp mind, but his energy was not as radiant as the regal colors of the dashiki he wore. We spoke about the Caribbean Court of Justice and the conditions of the poor in the Port of Spain. I told him that he helped birth an entire generation of children who were given African names. I thank him for his contribution on behalf of young people, even though I knew my generation would walk past him in the street with little to no recognition. I wanted to honor him for his struggle, not just show him my respect for what he had done, but also show him respect for the man he was. I left Port of Spain that morning unimpressed. The man who once commanded the crowd with his fist in the air stammered. He spoke slowly. The closest he came to a power fist was when he clenched the handle of his teacup. Years later, I know that it was my eyes, not really the sight of Dagger, is the way I was seeing Dagger that was kind of off. Few have the fortune of Fidel Castro to age with their revolution. I've never really seen a revolutionary at age 40, age 60, age 70, at age 80 without their revolution. Think about Che Guevara, Bob Marley, Maurice Bishop, young, beautiful, and they died young and beautiful. What is beautiful about old age when so much that you have struggled for has produced very little today and is forgotten by so many? How do you make peace with your youth, with large crowds, just end up walking on the pavement with little recognition? What happens to revolutions that do not grab hold of the state or even notice a kind of mythical power? How do revolutionaries wake up every morning to no revolution, make tea, talk to their husband and wife, make groceries, travel to the corridors of powerlessness? Many are afraid to die, but some people fear that their dreams die first. I think McConnell Dagger saw his revolution die, and he saw his people march on through history as if nothing was ever there. And in 2016, a collective of students at the UE hosted a very small gathering in remembrance of McConnell Dagger for his radical vision for Trinidad and Tobago. He is the greatest guild president we have had at the University of the West Indies and student leader in the history of Trinidad and Tobago. The majority of the youth who attended that small remembrance event said they did not know who he was, but they wanted to learn more about his life. I think their humility must count for something, because when we are denied our history and our liberators are forgotten, remembering itself becomes a revolutionary act. So today, I would like to lift the memory of McConnell Dagger, our most prolific, outstanding, and historically significant student leader at the University of the West Indies and in Trinidad and Tobago. Thank you.
Massa days done. Massa days done. Massa days done. We caught in a world of love and despair. In between a hard place and a comfy chair. You see, my decisions are not shrouded by wear and tear, but by this unclear certainty that you propose to me in this 21st century are having vague memories all of the past. I never had to cut no grass or pick no cotton. Today's life is all a push of a button. Share, like, repost, like, repost, like, repost, like. It's unlikely you like me after my message of your indictment that brings sorrowful excitement to those who pay a blind ear. They say who don't hear go feel so. Does it mean that who feels will hear the cries of over 1,000 years? Not fair. Is slavery still around? No, you might say. Yet for all your work a 9-to-5 job and you can never see where your salary goes when the month end comes. Is Jim Crowism still around? No, you might say. Yet for all when you turn on the television, cultural imperialism at its finest, racial profiling, police out of timing. It's a shame what's happening in the USA. I just want to know, is slavery still applicable today? It shrivels in our mind like a poisonous serpent. The hate, the pain, the anguish. I have no time for your childish behavior. These haunting memories we play in my mind over and over and over like a internal drunkenness that could never sober. I am not of hate. I am not of revenge. But I am of remembrance. Remembrance of how great of a people we were and continue to be, excelling in sports, sciences, engineering, anything at all, you name it, we have claimed it. So don't you dare call me a nig. I just want to spread love in this beautiful place we call Earth, and that every creed and race find our equal place in this place we call home.
And yes, and that spoken word was from Mr. Odudua Aluko. And indeed, we just now had some informative stuff there being so well postulated by Mr. Sanatan. And certainly we are here at the Emancipation Matters Part 2, where we are discussing all things Africanism in this space. We, of course, he would have went through Makanda Daga, who was, of course, well, as he said, the most prolific student leader within the Western Hemisphere, with their say, going forward. And of course, you don't want to miss Amilcar, because he will return in our very exciting Q&A session coming very soon. But of course, we have with us 3 young people who will be coming to discuss certain topics in a panel discussion segment. We have with us Ms. Nkizi Charles, the Chief Cook and Bottle Washer of today's program, the President of the African Students Union, who will be talking about the impact of colonialization on Afro-Trinbagonians. We will then have as well Mr. Nathaniel John, former Vice President, and of course I will dare say one of our most recent student advocates we would have had. He would have went through certain things and he would have seen various forms of brutality in this country, and he would have faced the bullet, but of course he would have said strong, and he's coming to talk about psychological slavery and self-fulfilling prophecy, Nati. Then you also have as well Ms. Kylie Romaine, the very erudite Kylie Romaine, a recording artist and a young entrepreneur, talking about affirmative action in Trinidad and Tobago. They all will be discussing and sharing their views and perspective to us today. And of course, we will be having some great work coming out of their discussions. And of course, I introduce at first Ms. Charles to bring her contributions to us today. I continue to share the live, ask your questions, and of course, send the claps in the chat as we have great insights coming forward. So I bring on Ms. Charles.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Mr. Guild President. It's my pleasure to be here today to talk to you all about the impact of colonization on the Afro-Caribbean community. Many of the issues that we face as the Afro-Caribbean community are not unique to us, but they are part of a global Black struggle to secure our humanity in a world which often, too often, seeks to invalidate us, discriminate against us, and humiliate us. The struggle of Black hair and professionalism, microaggressions at work and at play, the criminalization of Black bodies without evidence, and a false narrative of inferiority. These are all a global Black struggle experienced even within Africa itself. However, in post-colonial islands such as Trinidad and Tobago, who are riddled with Eurocentric ideals and a history that is far too ambiguous to most, we especially find it difficult to reconcile our African roots, and so do the rest of our society. While the white population in Trinidad and Tobago today is not seen as significant in terms of numbers, the descendants of planters still wield a great deal of influence and wealth within Trinidad and Tobago. However, though many Europeans left, the cancer of capitalism still played an integral part in how our nation was built. Classism is still a prevailing issue within our society, and we make jokes about our stush friends from the West and the ghetto youths from Laventille, but we never really stop to question and examine why the best schools are only made available to those from a specific geography or income brackets. We never wonder why some communities are gated with high mansions and members only shopping, while others are filled with children who are starving, and not just for food, but for opportunity and validity in a society that decided they could not amount to much before they were even afforded an opportunity to prove themselves. And even when they do prove themselves, it is a well-known fact that putting your address as Silot or Beetham or Laventille on your resume is not a good idea. It can't exclude you from employment regardless of your qualifications. Yes, there are three Trinidads. The one experienced by tourists who marvel at the splendid scenery and the sweet taste of the coconuts. The one experienced by the rich who comfortably live off the labor of the last group. The poor, of which sweet, sweet tea and tea is a bitter myth. So we must examine our history and understand how we arrived here. We must reflect on the genocide and the abuse of our forgotten indigenous peoples. We must reflect on the plantations and the brutality endured by the enslaved. We must reflect on freedom, emancipation. Are they one and the same? We must understand and reflect on George Beckford's plantation society and note the correlations in how we stratify ourselves today. We must reflect on the Black Power revolution which we had through America in the 1970s and their struggle against class and race and color discrimination. Yes, we must reflect on all these things, the bitter genesis of our colonial past, in order to understand and assess where we are today. Only then can we make sense of why our geography is divided by class, why it is so easy to call a Black person monkey during election season, why red skin is fetishized and natural hair is seen as unprofessional. Then and only then can we begin to comprehend issues we see today and reimagine a different present and a better future. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nick and Kizzy Charles. Of course, she said we must examine our history. We must reflect on our past. And of course, we must now change the dynamic as we move forward. Continue to think of these things. Think on these things, people. Think on these things. And of course, I will move on straight ahead to our second panelist to come to share with us Mr. Nathaniel John, former Guild Vice President. The floor is yours, sir.
Hello, good day, everyone. It's a greeting to be here, and I do appreciate this discussion. It says something actually that we are still having this discussion in 2021, meaning that we, somewhere along the line, we have fallen short. And psychological slavery, as well as self-fulfilling prophecy, is actually two very integral roles in why we are still here today. We are no longer enslaved by chains. We are no longer enslaved simply by an economic system, but now it is done on a mental level. When we look at what has been happening throughout the past decades, persons have been calling for firstly, a psychological revolution. Because before you can take up arms, before you can change the law, etc., you first have to have a change of mind as to where you want to be as a people, but firstly, as yourself. Because your minds, although your minds are connected on the human collective level, it starts at a personal level where you first have to understand where you have been enslaved mentally to believe certain notions about your culture, to believe certain notions about your diet in terms of health, certain notions about the type of economic system that you have to follow. There are so many different things where we are mentally enslaved now, and some of us do not realize it. So conversations like this are necessary and are needed. And what I want to focus on specifically as I want to say Afro-Caribbean youth and Afro-Caribbean people is starting there. It's starting to erase certain stereotypes, certain beliefs that we have about ourselves, about the diet. Why are we still eating certain foods in 2021? People say it's because our ancestors have passed it on, but were those practices the best practices that they got during the enslavement period or even indentured period? All of these things tie into each other. We simply look at psychological slavery in terms of the Afro-Caribbean identity simply from enslavement period. But it transcends that because we are still here even 100 years later. So what I'm really come here to say is in terms of a lie. That is the theme I really want to focus on today. It all started where somebody told a lie. Somebody told a lie about your hair. Somebody told a lie about the type of foods you have to eat. Somebody told a lie about why you do not identify in terms of your Afro-Caribbean identity, why you look at certain people in a particular manner. They told a lie about the type of education that you need to get, what you need to pursue. And it all stems from a lie that a group of persons told in terms of benefiting for themselves. And now it is on the onus on us, mainly as youth, because a lot of persons, when you reach a certain age, sorry to say, a lot of persons become very crystallized in their thinking. And I'm not saying that you throw them at the wayside when it comes to the psychological way of thinking. However, I really want us to focus in terms of bringing the up-and-coming generation correctly, positively, progressively, because a lot of us has not gotten that type of support that is required, especially on a mental level. When you look at a lot of problems that are taking place across the region, it's not simply in terms of persons and their cultural identity. It transcends all of these different things. So when we're looking at psychological slavery, these things must come together to have a holistic understanding of why we need to change certain behaviors and why we need to fix our way of thinking as it relates to not just what a particular group of persons see as Afro-Caribbean identity. It's much greater than that. And you as an individual first have to make that psychological revolution to understand and believe those lies that you were told before are not true. And you have to be willing to actually challenge all of the laws, the politics that you see. You have to be willing to challenge these things because that's the only way that you are going to get out of this lie that has been told to you for so many years about yourself and about your identity. Now, in terms of how that relates into self-fulfilling prophecy, simply because you are told all of these false expectations throughout the years, many persons actually start to believe those stereotypes. For example, watching TV nowadays, right? There are certain stereotypes that even Black movies portray. Now, when you see this identity of what Blackness or Africanness looks like through on TV, a lot of people take these false expectations of what Black identity is supposed to be.
We would have lost Mr. John there. Certainly, I think you will come back in the Q&A section to finish his contributions. But we're gonna go straight into our third panelist, Ms. Kylie Stromain, who is going to talk to us on affirmative action in Trinidad and Tobago, which of course is a great thing for us to start our Q&A with going forward. So I want to bring on Ms. Stromain, who is a young entrepreneur. I have worked with her before, and I must say I love her resilience. I'm very sure she's going to bring her resilience with us today. So I bring on Ms. Kylie Stromain, one of our very own.
Hi, thank you for the opportunity to speak on affirmative action. So I wanted to start by giving a definition on what affirmative action is. Simply put, it's the implementing of social policy established on the basis of recognizing that a specific group in society has been disadvantaged, discriminated against, marginalized, disenfranchised, neglected, and all that bad stuff. And I wanted to start by giving a definition because I don't think that is a concept many are aware of. Not too long ago, I myself didn't know what affirmative action was. It was after encountering the term several times when reading, I was like, let me go look up this term. And when I looked it up, I realized that the ideological basis of what affirmative action is an ideology that I myself also had. You know, when it comes to mental health in Trinidad, I always believe that we aren't culturally competent, you know, when it is certain issues come to light, like juvenile delinquency and crime and how it's dealt with, it isn't dealt with the understanding of one's history as a person. And when I say history, I don't mean individual history. I mean what their ancestors would have gone through, what their forefathers would have gone through. Because our history as a people, collectively, what our ancestors went through, it trickles down into our present reality. And so those traumas manifest in our crime rate, those traumas manifest in the education system, those traumas manifest in an array of ways, you know. So I think that it's important that we understand why affirmative action is needed in Trinidad and Tobago, because there are certain communities, it's not just the African community, and even within the African community, there are different communities that have been disadvantaged as a result of their history. And so when coming up with solutions, when implementing social policy, coming up with programs, we have to keep in mind the history of these communities. So yeah, that's it for me.
Thank you very much, Ms. Romain. Affirmative action in our country, in our region, in our world regarding, of course, emancipation. And certainly, this is indeed a great precursor to where we are going now. And we are now heading into a very exciting and engaging process. And I want to ask you all to please send your questions. Please send your questions to us, YouTube and Facebook. We have a very strong panel. You would have heard it yourself. You would have heard very distinguished Mr. Sanatan and the doc himself. We would have heard Nathaniel, we've heard Nikizi, as well as Kylie's. Strong people coming to who are very much conscious and educated on this matter. So bring your questions forward so that we can start this conversation. Of course, we have a few here, and I want to bring back on Dr. Lovell Francis here. And Doc, we would have heard your contributions on the fight to emancipation. And of course, we want to ask you to tell us what were some efforts made by the ex-enslaved during the post-emancipation period to ensure a better future for their children and generations to come?
Right. One of the most obvious of those, which I mentioned a bit, not in significant detail, was that fight for education. Now, I would have mentioned that every slave code, every quote-unquote slave code in the Caribbean and the Americas made it very clear that it was against the law to educate the enslaved. Often, enslaved persons who could read, if you were found, you would be mutilated, or in the worst case scenario, you would be killed. Now, in the post-emancipation period in Trinidad and Tobago, there is a tremendous amount of interest in the Afro population in education, and there is a tremendous fight of parents who were enslaved to ensure that their children become educated. Now, let me set the stage. During the 19th century, there is a culture war in Trinidad in particular, not so much in Tobago, culture war in Trinidad, and education becomes caught up in that culture. You have a colony where you have a French Creole elite on one side, and you have a British colonial government on the other side. And they are trapped in a sort of a culture war for control of Trinidad. Education becomes part of that conflict. So, for example, if one side, the English, they build Queen's Royal College, the other side builds St. Mary's College. If one side starts opening primary schools, the other side starts opening primary schools. There is a contestation for the identity of the colony, for the control of the colony. Now, neither of these groups have any real interest in the educating of African people. Neither of them have any interest in even having people of African origin follow their religions. But in that social contestation, having numbers on your side matters. So all of a sudden, both the Anglican Church and the Catholic Church get involved in education, and they're very interested in providing schooling to people who they don't like, and worse again, people who know that they are not liked. So the ex-enslaved know that these churches, know that these institutions do not like them. But the willingness, the interest, the desire to have their children become literate, to have their children become educated, they look past that. And there is a massive upswing in terms of literacy amongst the children and the grandchildren of the ex-enslaved. So much so that there is an English author named James Anthony Frow. And in the late 19th century, he is touring the Caribbean. And he is writing about the plight of the Negro, as though persons of African origin are some sort of, condemned and benighted people who will never see their way in life. And he gets his most fervent response from an Afro-Trinidadian named J.J. Thomas, who writes a book called Fraudacity that I would recommend all of you, if not read, take a look at, because it is the best written answer to dotishness I have ever read in my life. And he literally takes fraud apart. So I would say education is one of those most significant things, but also in terms of economic development. We don't understand, there is this mythical belief that people of African origin abandoned agriculture because of the experience of life on the plantation. That's not true. What they wanted to abandon was exploitation of their labor. They wanted to be paid a proper wage. The people who owned the plantations did not want to do that. They preferred to bring in a replacement laboring population. But people of African origin, many of them did not abandon agriculture. Many of them, particularly in Tobago, became peasant farmers. So much so that Tobago in the 19th century was the breadbasket of Trinidad. A lot of food that fed the Trini population in the 19th century came from Tobago. Many persons of African origin became cocoa farmers in Trinidad, so that by 1870, the cocoa industry was booming. A significant part of that was small proprietors, peasant farmers who were producing high quality cocoa, the best in the world. A lot of people went to the towns. They went to Port of Spain, they went to San Fernando, they went to Scarborough, and they became tradesmen because many of them had trades that they learned on the plantation. And these trades are passed on to their children. And they end up rising in terms of however possible, a small way, in terms of their social status.
But if I might ask you, Doc, why it is that these efforts that you would have so quietly now said there, why are they not as developed as it's supposed to be now? We are still struggling to make a viable agricultural product. If agriculture was a way to empower the children of slaves. So please tell me and tell us why today we're still struggling with that.
Agriculture?
And other efforts that
in the late 19th century, we discovered this magical oil. And we started to evolve into an energy-centered economy, and agriculture became sort of a backseat thing. Then in the 1930s, there was a disease called witch broom, and that sort of devastated the cocoa industry, and we have not fully recovered. But what you really have is an economy that is evolving away from agriculture into energy. So agriculture becomes less significant in terms of our output.
But I
want to make the point to answer the question you're really asking. What you're really asking is about development of the Afro-Trinidadian people. And what I will say to this is that people need to understand development is not necessarily always a straight line. And do not make an eternity of the moment. People look at a moment in history and 100 years, and as you rightly said, somebody said it before, I think it was America, 50 years is not a long time in the history of a nation. 200 years is not a long time in the history of a people. People in Africa were building pyramids in 3500 BC when people in Europe were living in caves. Africa has a long history. African people have a long history. In terms of the length of the history, 50 years is no time, 100 years is no time. So you don't judge a people based on a particular point in their history. History is a continuum, and then development is never a straight line. There are ups, there are downs, there are reversals. So history is not progressive in that narrow sense, not it marches from one point and improves and improves. Sometimes there are reversions, sometimes there are inversions, sometimes development falls off, you have to get back on the tracks. It's never ever a straight line. But you don't make a snap judgment saying that, oh, you're backward because of that, because there is a long history here.
And I want to pause in here, of course, he said do not make an eternity of a moment in history. Yeah. But I want to move on to Mr. Sanathan for a moment. And you would have heard America's contribution on systemic racism and how in the 1970s, particularly, and how McCandle Dagger would have treated that. But I want to ask the very goodly Sanathan, do you think that systemic racism is still an issue in modern day Trinidad and Tobago region? And if so, what are some measures that we can take to address it?
Thank you very much. And again, thanks, Dr. Francis. Really profound contribution about making an eternity out of that moment. Before I try to speak to the contemporary, there's a report also read the Hugh Wooden Commission on, I don't know if it's on racial equality, but looking at race relations in Trinidad and Tobago afterwards, it becomes a profound document that really speaks to and gives an analysis of some of the critiques around and the perceptions that people felt and they saw, especially around financial sector. The Hugh Wooden report gave the data around it. The University of the West Indies also had the Institute for Racial Relations once upon a time. And Professor Selwyn Ryan would have played a role in that. Professor Laguerre doing work on ethnic studies and looking at social outcomes with ethnicity. And then now that is kind of taboo in our society. Though it was then, but we need to understand that it's not that we want to be determinists about ethnicity, but there are different social outcomes for various historical reasons and spatial reasons. The way geography organizes around certain ethnic groups gives certain outcomes. And today, of course, there's systemic racism. An important turn in the Black Power movement would be their solidarity with the students in the Sir George Williams incident, Sir George Williams affair in Montreal, Canada. Society which was seen as liberal, inviting to foreign students and having a certain type of multiculturalism and an approach to the global world. And the knock on Canada was that it was a subtle form of racism. It wasn't the overt type of abuse African Americans experience in the United States. Likewise, in Trinidad and Tobago, on one level, we'll take up Professor Burton's narrative of all our way is not one. How there are certain narratives of the nation, of the multicultural, multiracial nation, that oftentimes exclude persons who assert an African identity. And that exclusion doesn't only come from non-Africans, but Afro-Creoles, persons who embrace the idea that African identity, African terms of being and participation in the independent state is in line with European and Western values. Where systemic racism we see oftentimes happens around colorism in the society. Colorism has preferred sectors, so preferred colors, complexions for persons to work in certain sectors. And I don't hurt any feelings with identifying one, but the key one, which has long been criticized, is around marketing and communications. Marketing and communications departments continue to privilege persons in lighter skin. In fact, we used to make this joke. You would think only light-skinned people drink milk if you read the newspaper. You would think only light-skinned people take loans, right? There's this idea of a nuclear family, a stable one. But also systemic racism is about producing who integrates and how. We continue to have the narrative, and this is unfortunate, where we have the Afro brown-skinned Creole male, the Indian woman, and the mythical Douglas child that comes to represent the nation. So when we want to be representative of Trinidad and Tobago, it must be a black man, oftentimes brown and maybe mixed, an Indian woman, and a mixed race child. And that is the way we do it. But whenever it has come to signify one particular group, right, it seems to be excluded. And oftentimes when it has come to represent the black one, there's a certain angst and rage against black representations of the nation. And we need to think about, because race is complex, is no one group has hegemony in a total way. And there are ways as well, African narratives, Afro-Creole narratives might exclude others, right? Those are things we have to grapple with as a society. But we should never suffer the illusion that blackness as a color is at the bottom of the social strata, and African people themselves, because of the historical dispossession, continue to suffer from certain things. And that's why Nikisi's arguments around the discourses about who is the Zesta, not just as a construct of entertainment in a community, but Zesta coming to signify other things. Who deserves social shame more than others? And what kind of social shame a group gets a little bit more license in the society than for other persons? And then the last thing, sorry, Kobe, and I wouldn't deal with this now, is systemic racism does not mean that there was always a deliberate effort to dispossess people. It might also come out of neglect, where a group of people are in a social situation and do not receive the specific support they need to move out of it. And the post-independent state actually has some of those challenges. Dr. Lover would know about it in education. I would know more about it in urban development, and there are some issues. But of course, it's
Mamilka, tell me
Yeah.
something. Do you think, and I'm asking a very hot topic here. Do you think that Black people cause their own criminals? Because you have a notion that Black people don't even appreciate their own culture. You understand? I remember going on the beach, and of course we know that when we go on the beach, we will have our Indian colleagues playing their chutney, playing their music, enjoying their culture. But when asked about us, we shame to play our own music and wear our own clothes. Do you think that Black people contribute to their own issues in society?
Yeah, be quick on this one. Sometimes the best voice for sexism comes from a woman. Sometimes the best voice for classism might even come from the poor. And likewise, anti-Black racism, the best voice for it might come from a person who looks like me, right? And in fact, the experience, think about the racist violence. Girls combing their hair on the gallery, and a mother might be comparing hair textures among siblings. Racism is not always a grand experience in the public domain. It's about one comb made in China, cracking in your hair, becomes a whole conversation about racism that you live with. And it's about, again, boys in school talking about the reds and the proverbial darkie, and then creating a color hierarchy about their intimacy, who they like. So racism comes from people like us. That is no question. And in our culture, internally, we have this critique. We ask these questions. And of course, in literature, when we read Earl Lovelace, when we read Lisa Allen Agostini, when we read even V.S. Naipaul, right, we get to see how there are microforms of racism we do it. But I would never say Black people are our worst enemy. We never created the form of racism that took away land from people, that enslaved people for hundreds of years, and had no intention of them creating a society of equality after they left. You have countries in Africa where 8 persons had university education at the time of independence. There was no desire to create a society, even if they liberated them from their chains. So these are the types of, I think, conversations we need to have, and know that internally we have work to do and hold each other accountable, but we never think that we are the greatest perpetrators of racism against our kind.
Thank you very much, Amilka, for answering that.
Kobe, is it okay if I jump on that question too?
Of course, continue.
Right, so you said something about other members of other ethnicities being able to celebrate their cultures openly. I just have 2 points about that. First of all, we would have had a legacy of being purposefully alienated from our culture. So we do not have that same attachment that other people of other ethnicities would be able to have to theirs. We have to purposefully go out and seek to learn what African culture is, because the opportunity for it to be passed on from parent to child, grandparent to the parent, it's not there for us. It was purposefully stolen. It was illegal in a lot of ways, especially religious ways. So whatever fragments of that we were able to keep and preserve through our different cultural expressions, especially in Carnival, is what we would be able to hold on to and maybe look back and find something. But we don't have that same history. We don't have the same privilege of having a thorough attachment to our own culture. And that's the reason for both the internal attitudes towards it and the external attitudes towards it. Internalized racism is a big problem, and it continues to be an issue that I see prevailing among us. And we see oftentimes it stratifies itself based on class as well. Like middle class Black people or richer Black people tend to look down on the poor and say, yeah, you causing your own problems, etc. And the other day I was asking Milka a question about criminality, and he was reminding me that Black men and criminality, you can't just take it out and treat it like it's just like a fairy tale. There is context to everything, and oftentimes poverty exacerbates the tendency towards crime and criminality. So yeah, that's what
Yeah,
I want to say about that.
certainly. And of course, Kizzy just is running into my next question, and this is open to any of the panelists, so you could jump in any time to ask as we come down on the Q&A. And I want to ask a question. Can any one of you tell me and tell the audience a bit of your own journey with your own Black identity?
I think I will tackle this one.
No problem, Kylie.
Earlier. I wrote a book called Bubble's Teenage Life Story. And the reason why I wrote the book is because I think that many aren't aware of what young African girls go through, specifically dark-skinned African girls. And in my journey, not accepting myself, hating the color of my skin, hating my hair texture, hating my features, that landed me in correctional institutions such as St. Jude's and women prison as a juvenile. And it was not until I was 18 years old when I realized why I was doing what I was doing. I couldn't go outside unless I had a weave in my hair, the longest weave. I couldn't go outside if I was looking a certain way. I was ashamed to let people see me a certain way. And I really had to do some introspection as to why I feeling this way, why I doing these things. And I realized that who I was, the aggressive nature I had, always fighting, always in some bacchanal, it was because I felt like I always had to defend myself. From being told as a child, you're black like pitch and you're picky-headed, you know? These things, I internalized these things and it affected me on my journey. So my journey as it pertains to like knowing myself and being proud of who I am as an African woman, it entailed a lot of unlearning and a lot of embracing. Nothing is wrong with dark skin. It's just another complexion. I'm a human, you know, accepting that nothing is wrong with my hair texture. So I cut my hair, I went natural, I do all kind of thing, you know. But basically it took me to a place where I had to realize that I'm more than my hair, I'm more than my skin, you know, as India Ray said.
Thank you very much, Candy, for sharing that touching and really impacting story there. And I want to, of course, just chime into another question, and anybody could reach it, probably you, Nati, to tell us, you know, what are those prevailing issues that Black people face today? And you would have mentioned some in your discussion earlier. What are some issues Black people face today in our Caribbean society?
Yeah, sure, no problem. Two things, because I will specifically touch on, actually, because there are so many different issues that are prevailing in our community throughout the Caribbean. One, I would say, touching back into the topic that I would have spoken on, actually, is that psychological slavery. And everyone here who spoke within this question and answer actually spoke on different fragments of what psychological slavery will entail. Systemic racism, and why we in certain departments such as marketing and communications or media would want a Black identity that is marketable. For instance, I would say the community of, let's say, reggae music, right? I'm calling out a group here, the Wailers. All respect due to them. But you have to beg the question, why was Bob Marley able to be more marketable opposed to Peter Tosh, who was more of the revolutionary or the entirely Black power side of the Wailers, you would say. Although all of them in their rights were, Peter Tosh had that Black identity that we tend to run away from. In Kylie's, when she's speaking about in terms of, and when you're growing up and you hear about like you black like pitch, etc., right? All of these are things that we have internalized throughout the years, whether we grew up hearing it ourselves or then we went out into the world and began to hear it, right? Because personally speaking, when I was at home, I'd never heard, and I was always proud about my blackness. I grew up watching black movies, etc. So it's only when I went outside and I began to hear these things is when that psychologically started to impact me. You begin to fold your lips, you begin to use different creams to kind of get a certain complexion that is acceptable. And in today's society, we still have that taking place in different realms of the space. So you may see in terms of mainly African Caribbean women now, may be very interested in doing this, what is called the BBL. But where is the thoughts of the BBL coming from? Why do we want that particular shape or size? These are questions we have to ask ourselves as a community, because these are things that are being fed mainly through media, because this is what we are consuming. When you watch your shows, etc., it's men and women of a particular stature, and we don't really question why are they showing or representing just a fragment of what, quote unquote, your Black identity or Caribbean identity as an Afro person is. The next aspect I will want to touch on is actually capitalism. Now, capitalism has enjoyed the benefits of racism. Capitalism is a system bred on exploitation of certain groups of people, especially mainly Black persons and brown persons, etc., from the global South. And a lot of us now have adopted the same capitalism that have exploited a lot of our people. We may brand it as Black excellence, and I'm not saying you should be a bum and everybody should go live in the mountains, etc. No. But when we are taking up certain economic systems, is it to the benefit of our people, our community, or is it helping those who have oppressed us? Because if you are taking the same practices that they have used throughout the centuries to oppress us, to now use it for your benefit and brand it as Black excellence, when you're still exploiting your people, come on, we have to actually ask these two questions, right? So these are two things, again, I'm tying back into, because the mental aspect of it, it's in everything. We can't escape that, no how, no way. And I think that's one of the first places that we have to start. That psychological revolution, as America would have said, Makanda Daga first wanted first, as well as what we need to do. I even recall starting that campaign when I went up for a position on the first time, because I was impressed by Makanda Daga, I was impressed by Walter Rodney, Maurice Bishop, all these persons before us who preached Black power, etc., throughout their university life. So this is the two things, as I said, that I would say that are the issues that we need to focus on as Black people today.
Certainly. And of course, Mr. John would have just now hit the nail there. Many of us think that when you say colorism and trying to be fair, people will say that, you don't like yourself. But if you would have just now heard the contributions from America and the great Doc himself and Nathaniel and everyone else, you will realize that a lighter shade of skin is equal to opportunity. And because that was engraved in our minds, persons have to adjust to get opportunity and get chances in lives. So that is what we are here presenting to us here. But of course, we would have discussed. I'm seeing the hand of Amelka. I think you want to come in. So Amelka, come in and add your point.
No, I would be good. I just wanted to say I was moved by the different narratives by persons, and it's just proof Black life is not normative or even like a monolithic. It's different ways you get power in and out. I remember once I was disciplined in sixth form, and the administrator said, I was fighting in school, and she's like, for a brown skin boy, I find like you're supposed to have more sense. And she was really trying to pull me up, like, be a boy of your class. You're supposed to be the better groups than the Blacks. Why would you behave like them? But I never suffered that illusion, because when I was young, I also went to school in Barbados, right? Secondary school. And the biggest shock for me was that I came from Trinidad and Tobago. I'm not accustomed to seeing tourists, non-nationals walking around in a a kind of double-decker society. I always feel like the locals live on a little bed. If there's a pavement in the country, it's for tourists to walk more safely. Not because the average Barbadian, they are the indirect beneficiaries sometimes. And I don't want to criticize the government. It's a great society, taught me strong values, even around Blackness. But it's very hard when you go into a store and you know you are not the preferred customer, you know? But I got that. And then you would go in Toronto in the subway, and when I took a seat, a white man jumped over the seat. And that was the first time I realized what racism looks like every day for people, microforms. He didn't shout at me, he didn't curse at me, but to see someone jump over the seat when I wanted to sit on the metro, and I was embarrassed, I felt hurt, you know, and of course the crew I was with, they started to make an issue and this is racism, this is thing, and the comrade from Tanzania, you were shouting, and I was like, bro, like, I just want to go home, you know, like, you know, this is not my country. Let me live alive, and this is it. But it reminds me that the Black experience moves. And the scary part for me, there's no immigration office that likes me. No, not one immigration office is excited to see me walk through the line in the Caribbean, in Africa, and definitely not in Europe and United States. So I think we should take our varying experience of Blackness, think about it, and I think that makes us richer for it, you know? Not one experience determines it. And it's quite powerful when I heard all these stories, and sometimes you have some privilege, and sometimes we have a lot of oppression.
Yeah, thank you very much, Amilcar. And of course, we have a question from Facebook, and it's asking the panel, from your perspective, and this is from Daniel Subio, what would be the ideal post-emancipation state of being a member of the Black community in Trinidad and Tobago? Given the realities of history and the current realities, what would the ideal world look? So, and can the panel feel free to share your thoughts here?
Can you just repeat the question for me?
Of course. From your perspective, what would the ideal post-emancipation state of being a member of the Black community in Trinidad and Tobago and the Caribbean look like?
Is the person, I can give a try. Is the person referring to post-emancipation as in the 19th century or post-emancipation in a longer view? I'm not sure.
I'm not sure, but
I could answer any post-emancipation in the 19th century. What it meant, what was the ideal for the Afro-Trinidadian person was to be Mr. somebody or Miss somebody. Was something called being respectable. During enslavement, I went to Montserrat to do some research. And one of the areas I researched was looking at the list of people who were enslaved, their names. And literally it was the case that you'd be named anything, could be named dog, cat, but they literally named you any nonsense as a way of stripping your identity and stripping your sense of self. One of the important things for people in the post-emancipation period was to reclaim that selfhood and to reclaim that identity and to become somebody of worth and respect. So having a decent job, having a trade, being educated, educating your children, being married, having a stable family, those were the things that were critical to people of African origin in the 19th century, because they brought that sense of respectability and that sense of identity and significance with it. So I can answer it in that narrow context. If there's a longer expectation, that's a whole different discussion.
Of course, and of course, we'll have a part 3 soon. You'll have a part 3 soon, yes?
I'm sure. If I want to add one more thing, I don't want to jump in. I was enjoying the discussion on that previous question. I just want to add one anecdote, which is that the one thing that people of African origin should never allow themselves to be is trapped by somebody else's narrative. And I'm done with that.
Don't be trapped. Don't be trapped in someone else's narrative, people.
Yeah.
And of course, we are coming down to the solutions. We have to identify the issues. we would have demystified the problems. But now I want to ask, what are some things we can begin to solve the socio-economic and identity crisis issues facing the Afro-Caribbean community? What are those solutions?
I think
it's
it's
wide
much
open.
If
Yeah, go ahead, Doc.
I can jump in again and play boldface.
Yes, play boldface.
Amilcar will give you the theoretical answer. I could give you a historical answer, but I'll just give you a straightforward answer as one African man to another. You gotta take care of your home. You gotta mind your business. You have to provide for your family. You have to educate your children. You have to establish a legacy. You have to teach them that they need to have a legacy. My parents never went to secondary school, and they were able and they were capable. My mother passed on for my girls, but because she was poor, black, and from the country, from the bush, let me use the right term, from the bush. She never went one day. But my father, who was a carpenter and a mason, and my mother, who left her job to become a housewife, they were adamant that the three miserable boys they made would have a better life than them. And they sacrificed. So two people who never had an education beyond the primary level, they produced one PhD, one doing a PhD, and one he happy with the BSc. That's what you do. You start off with the home, and it becomes a snowball effect from there. But African women, and African men, you gotta start with what's in front of your eye, and that is your home. Get your home in order, and let everybody else get their home in order, and then we have a bigger discussion about the larger framework. But start at the home.
Thank you very much, Mr.
Francis. To jump in,
yes.
After Dr. Francis, because I have that same belief in terms of that snowball effect, because we are very individualized now as a people, as a group. We don't think community. And as Dr. Francis would have said, it's a snowball effect. A nation is a collection of communities.
That's right.
A community is a collection of families.
That's right.
And a family is a connection of individuals. So when you are looking to build, right, you first have to start at your home. As I say, organize your home first before you look to go and build somebody else's home. And we actually have to start doing this. We can't just leave it as a saying. We actually have to start doing so. And it always starts with education. Sadly, again, our curriculum has not been to the benefit of our true history, or the closest thing to that true history. So we also have to incorporate this into the day-to-day living of our children, of our adolescents, and even our adults, because learning don't stop at a particular age group, etc. So this is where all of the work needs to begin to start. Reclaiming that identity, reclaiming things, certain words, certain phrases that belong to you, and give power to it. Don't run from it because it appears negative, or it has been deemed negative by a particular group of people. Learn for yourself. Learn to challenge the education that has been given to you. Challenge the stereotypes, all of these things that you have been hearing over the years, and understand where it has come from, and understand why it is not beneficial to the development of your people. Right? So again, it starts from home, and you work your way out, but do it in a strategic manner, together, and not individualized. Yeah.
Start from your home. Fix your house. Fix your house. Fix your home. And we are coming down to the time, but I want to ask the panel to act on the same question. What advice you can give young people who might be, questioning their identity as a Black woman, as a Black man? What can you tell them today? Panel.
Okay, I'll start, right? I'll say that from what I have observed, because we live in a world, in a society which is so accustomed and used to viewing Black people as inferior, even a Black person loving themselves is a revolutionary act. And that in and of itself can create some discomfort for the people around you. Don't be bothered by the discomfort of those around you. If you want to go to work in your dash, you go. That's your right. That's your culture. You know, if you want to name all your African names, go through, right? Don't be afraid of being viewed as a radical or a particular way. We have a right to our culture, we have a right to our heritage, and to embrace it the way everybody else has a right to. So yeah, that is my first tip. Don't be afraid. Second tip is to unlearn, right? Unlearn what you've previously been told and learn anew again, because we are indeed not inferior. And that in and of itself is a lie of the many lies that we have been told. On a wider level, as a society, we really need to change the attitudes towards racism and start having some important conversations. Dr. Lovell could probably go on and on about how the lateral hostility between East Indians and Africans started in the first place and how it's still continuing today. But we really need
Divide
to
and conquer.
Yes, divide and conquer, right? So we really need to address that and not be scared to have the kind of conversations that are necessary to solve the racial divide in this country. It's absolutely necessary. And that's really all I have to say.
Thank you very much, Kizzy, for your kind words. So, of course, don't be afraid. Don't be afraid. And this here is the Guild of Students, African Students Union, in collaboration with the African Society, coming together to educate the population, society. This here is advocacy in activity taking place. And I want to, of course, thank the panel for their erudition and their education today. I myself has been educated a lot. I did history in CSEC, but that's all I have. But certainly you all would have well brought diligent perspectives in our conversation today. And I want to thank you so much. And of course, heading into our vote of thanks, we are sorry we are at the end, but however, the action moves on. According to Kailis, we must have affirmative action. It must continue beyond today, and we continue to preach the gospel. That, of course, according to the doc, fix your home, look after yourself. According to Kizzy, don't be afraid. And of course, there are some certain points that you can look back to see what was said today. And I want to let those things carry you and be with you always. And bringing the vote of thanks is, of course, the National Affairs Chairperson, the very distinguished Darian Thomas, to bring the vote of thanks this afternoon. Darian, the floor is yours.
So let me just say it's an honor and a privilege to be given the opportunity to give the vote of thanks. Firstly, I want to thank Almighty God for giving us this day which He has made, and this was definitely a day that we had rejoiced and we were glad in to be. I'd also like to thank Him for making today's occasion a success. Now, first and foremost, I'd like to thank our specially invited keynote speakers, the first one being Dr. Lovell Francis, former Minister in the Ministry of Education and a former MP for Ruga-Tableland, who, despite of his busy schedule, had found the time to grace this occasion with fruitful discussion on colonization, slavery, and the fight for emancipation. I'd also like to thank our second keynote speaker, Amilcar Sanatan, who spoke and educated us on Mukandal Daga and the challenge to the seismic racism during the 1970s. Now I'd like to thank all our panelist members and Kizzy Charles, who spoke on the impact of colonization, Nathaniel John, who touched on his psychological slavery and self-fulfilling prophecy. Now I'd like to thank our final panelist, Kailis Rumain, who spoke on affirmative action in TNT. I'd now like to thank all our various UE members, societies, and groups who have contributed towards making this event a success in terms of supporting and planning the African Students Union, the UE African Society for their support in planning and sending us videos, the songs, the dancing. It was just all the performances, it was just lovely. The Girl PRO Committee for their support in all the lovely graphic designs and having this event live stream. A special thanks to the National Affairs Committee for their help in planning and supporting, And a big special thanks to our Guild President, who is also our host for this event, and for giving us a good time to be a part of Emancipation Matters Part 2. Lastly, but not forgotten, a special thanks to all our behind-the-scenes persons and persons' names who I may not have acknowledged, who would have been instrumental in making today's a success. Special thanks to our specially invited guests from TTT, who have taken the time out of their busy schedules to tune in, and for also giving Nkizi Charles and myself the opportunity to be on the TTT Now Morning Show to share on emancipation and to also promote our event. A special thanks to you all. A special thanks to all our viewers and listeners, whether you're from UWI or the National Republic of Trinidad and Tobago. We thank you for being a part and tuning in today. For there are so many things that you could have been doing during this time, but you took the time to tune in and to participate. And so we thank you for tuning in today. And with that note, big up all yourselves for the support, and I hope you enjoyed and will utilize all that was shared today on emancipation. This is a publication by the National Affairs Committee in collaboration with the African Students Union, African Students Society, and Guild of Students. Emancipation Matters Part 2. This is only Part 2, so don't worry, there'll be more to come. I am Darian Thomas, your National Affairs Committee chairperson for this academic year. All the best, stay safe, and God bless.
And that was Mr. Darian Thomas. Thank you so much for your support, sir. Of course, the Guild of Students wishes you a happy Emancipation Day 2021. Of course, to close will be a song named Safa Safel Sizwe, and from the African Society to bless your hearts with. So I thank you and good night.
And that's the problem, you know. It's a retention. It's like people don't see that the Black nation is dying. Yes. True. The African nation is dying. Yes. It's true. Tell our leaders to do something about this problem.